Shadows in the Tempest. Chapter 1. Maya's father had a habit of hitting her whenever she would interrupt him. Face swollen, she would place an ice pack over her cheek and retreat to her room, seeking refuge in the quiet company of her books and sketches. The bedroom was her sanctuary, a private world where her father's toxic shadow couldn't reach. Her mother had been long gone by then, claimed by the crashing of ocean waves. Once Maya was able to break free from the suffocating hold of her childhood home and receive a proper diagnosis of ADHD, everything in her life finally seemed to make sense. However, it was not surprising that she had chosen to stop speaking in public and remain mute at such a young age given her circumstances. Now, as an adult, she was faced with the task of handling men who belittled her by calling her names like stupid just for taking a little longer to fulfill their breakfast orders. In a diner like Seaside Serenity, it was mostly rich tourists. They came for the picturesque views of the harbor, the unique charm of a quaint seaside town, and to sample what was touted as the freshest seafood in the county. Patrons waltzed in with their summer tans, designer sunglasses perched atop their heads, and an air of entitlement that made Maya grit her teeth more often than not. She refused to acknowledge their degrading remarks or uncomfortable stares. However, the money she earned was just enough to pay the bills and keep a roof over her head. As the sun puddled golden across the wooden diner floor, highlighting its worn textures, another customer sauntered inside. He was a broad-shouldered man, wearing a crisp Yale blue linen shirt that elegantly matched his piercing eyes. A diamond-studded Rolex was wrapped around his wrist, catching glimmers of sunlight and showering tiny rainbows around the room. He moved with an assured swagger, exuding a confidence that seemed untouched by self-doubt or indifference. He took a seat at the counter, his sculpted features split into a roguish grin as he surveyed the scene before him. His eyes found Maya immediately, her long mahogany hair pinned up in a classic bun, wisps whirling around her face as she flitted between tables.
"Excuse me, miss," he drawled lazily, his voice rich like dark chocolate melting on a warm tongue. His gaze lingered on Maya, a tad too long for it to be respectable.
Maya flashed a bright customer service smile in response. Her cheerful persona was starkly at odds with the chill creeping up her spine as his gaze traced her figure. She held up her cleaning rag and hoped he wouldn't try to engage her in the sort of small talk that tourists always seemed to delight in.
"Can I order some of that sparkling smile of yours?" The man flirted openly.
Maya's discomfort peaked, and before she could back away, a voice cut across the diner.
"She's not on the menu."
It was Lily, who'd been working at the counter. With a wink to Maya, she sashayed towards them. Lily was a whirlwind amongst the quiet humdrum of the diner, a tornado of blonde curls and sunshine smiles. She wore her uniform like it was fashioned by Chanel, accentuating her curves. Her blue eyes twinkled, and there was a hint of mischief laced in their depths. At her approach, heads would turn. It was as if the room lightened with each step she took.
"Hi there, handsome." She greeted the man with a cheerful smile, her voice drizzled with honeyed warmth. "How about we get you something from our actual menu?"
She slid a laminated copy over the counter towards him. The man's confident smile faltered slightly under Lily's twinkling gaze. He picked up the menu reluctantly, while his eyes darted back to Maya one more time before focusing on his new companion.
"Well," he drawled again, this time less convincingly, "how about some eggs Benedict?"
His hands strayed from the menu to hover slightly towards Lily's waist, and he abruptly found himself on the receiving end of a warning glare from those sparkling blue eyes.
"We appreciate manners here," she said firmly, stepping back just out of his reach, "and hands where we can see them."
There was a steely note in her voice now that matched the gleam in her eye. The man looked taken aback, but managed a nod and kept his hands to himself as Lily turned to prepare his order. As she walked away, Maya met Lily's gaze and mouthed, "Thank you." Lily's lips twitched into a small smile, as if she were silently saying, "It's nothing to worry about," before she disappeared into the depths of the kitchen. Maya studied the man from the corner of her eye. He didn't seem like the type who would easily back down from what he wanted. And indeed, his rudeness wasn't well hidden for long. As Lily returned with a plate that held perfectly poached eggs atop an inviting pile of crisp bacon and warm buttered toast, a smirk reappeared on his lips. He extended a rough hand out towards her, even before she had the chance to properly set down his meal. With an overbearing air of arrogance, he ran his eyes up and down her figure, admiration thinly veiled by crudeness.
"With service like this, you must get a lot of tips," he commented casually, ignoring the warning clanging bells of her previous words.
Maya could see Lily's fingers tighten around the plate as she firmly set it down on the table, not missing the way her knuckles whitened imperceptibly. Her smile was polite, yet tight, a clear sign of strained patience.
"All in a day's work, sir," she said evenly, but the coolness in her eyes betrayed her unease.
The man chuckled at Lily's response, leaning back against the booth and making himself comfortable as though he were lounging at home instead of sitting in a bustling diner. He reached for his fork with an audacious air that contradicted his unrefined manners.
"Think I might just stick around for dessert?"
He drawled, eyes locked onto Lily in a way that made Maya's blood run cold. His obvious insinuation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Maya found herself gripping the edge of the counter hard enough to turn her knuckles white. Lily, however, was made of tougher stuff. She merely flicked him a glance, one eyebrow arched ever so slightly, as if to silently question his audacity. It was barely there and gone within seconds, replaced by a calm that seemed to radiate off her like an aura. The man's laughter, jagged and harsh, cut through the hum of the diner as he leaned further back into the booth. His elbows sprawled out as if he were staking claim over the entire table.
"Sassy, I like that," he sneered, his lips twisting into a cruel smile as he propped his boots up onto the edge of the table with a loud thud, shaking the delicate plates in their wake.
"No shoes on the table," Lily responded, her voice carrying a tone of steely authority that made several patrons turn to look. She set down the tray she was holding and stared at him unflinchingly, matching his insolence with her unwavering stance.
In response, the man let out a growl that sounded like grinding gravel beneath steel-toed boots. His face twisted into an ugly mask of rage as he swiftly removed his foot from the table, only to swing it around and aim it at Lily's shins in a cruel attempt at humor. He wanted to see her flinch, stumble, or perhaps even howl in pain. Undeterred, Lily danced out of his way with impressive grace and agility. Her movements were as fluid as they were swift, making the man's attempt seem childish in comparison. The man's grin faded, replaced by a scowl that deepened as Lily coolly returned to her previous position, without so much as batting an eye.
"Touch me again and see how fast my tolerance evaporates," said Lily in a chilling whisper, which sliced through the commotion of clinking cutlery and simmering conversations. She paused for effect, her gaze cutting sharper than any steel blade.
Lily then turned on her heel, her curls bouncing as she strode purposefully away from the table. Maya watched as the man could only glare at her retreating figure. She breathed out a sigh of relief when she saw Lily saunter towards the kitchen doorway, unscathed.
"Follow me," Lily called to Maya over her shoulder.
Without hesitation, Maya followed as she beckoned her forward. She trailed behind, mimicking Lily's steps. The kitchen was a stark contrast to the lively dining area beyond its swinging door. 2 chefs were manning the griddles. The women passed through the whirlwind of activity in the small space and headed towards the walk-in freezer unit, tucked away in the rear corner of the kitchen. The usually noisy clatter of pans was muted here. Every surface gleamed under a layer of frost.
"I'm okay," Lily reassured Maya as she closed the thick freezer door behind them. She began peeling off her apron stained with small splotches from spilled drinks and stray food particles. "I just hate grabby men," she added with a gritted smile, her breath fogging up in puffs in the chill of the freezer.
Her voice echoed off the cold metal walls. Maya nodded sympathetically, her warm breath also clouding in the frosty air as she took a step closer to Lily. She placed her hand delicately on Lily's shoulder in support.
"Let's take a break, Maya. Just 5 minutes," Lily finally said. Her dark brown eyes were fixed on a frothy patch on the floor where a can of whipped cream had burst. She kicked at the white foam with her worn-out shoe, sending tiny flakes soaring in the frosty air.
Maya let out a soft laugh, rich and hearty, despite the biting cold around them. Her hazel eyes sparkled with amusement under the dim overhead light, which cast long shadows over rows of stocked ingredients and chilled produce.
"No joke," Lily replied, her lips curving into a bold smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Rick's not here today, and I don't give a damn about his no-break policy."
Tucking a stray curl behind her ear with frozen fingers, Lily reached into her front pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. Maya watched with interest as Lily pressed it between her chapped lips and struck a match against the icy concrete floor. The match sputtered into life, casting an orange glow that danced upon Lily's face in beautiful contrast to the pale blue freezer light. In a swift and practiced movement, she lit the end of the cigarette, inhaling deeply before handing it to Maya. Maya hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the warm stick of tobacco. It wasn't her habit to smoke, but there was something about this shared act of rebellion that appealed to her otherwise guarded personality. She took it gently, an unspoken agreement passing between them.
"How was your weekend?" Lily ventured, shifting her weight from one foot to another. Her breath clouded in front of her face as she spoke, letting out a tiny puff of white smoke.
In response, Maya merely shrugged her shoulders under the light fabric of her blouse. Her silence hung in the air more profound than any words she might have spoken.
Lily looked at her friend curiously, patience and curiosity glinting in her eyes as they adjusted to the dim lighting around. "You didn't have fun?" Lily continued probing, rubbing her hands together in an attempt to ward off the icy chill that had settled around them.
Maya shrugged again, taking another hesitant puff from the cigarette before passing it back to Lily. The action was accompanied by a vague look of distaste that wrinkled her nose for a fleeting moment before it was gone again.
"Well," Lily began, accepting the cigarette with a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She took a moment to let out a long exhale, her breath mingling with the smoke and disappearing into the frigid air. "My weekend was interesting." Lily paused, her eyebrows furrowing in thought as she searched for the right words. "I went on a date with Matt on Saturday. You remember him, right? The cashier from the local 7-Eleven?
Maya nodded. A hum of approval escaped through her chapped lips.
Lily continued, leaning closer to Maya as if she were about to share a secret. "We decided to go to our favorite beach after dinner. A little moonlight exhibitionism, if you catch my drift." She laughed as Maya nodded before continuing her story. "When we got there, though, Crescent Bay was closed. There were officers crawling all over the place."
Maya leaned in too, hoping that Lily would go on.
"Well," Lily hesitated for a beat before pushing onward. "Rumors are they found a body washed up on shore."
Maya's sharp intake of breath was lost amidst the loud hum of the freezer.
"A woman's body," Lily specified after a pause, taking another drag from the cigarette. "The police are trying to keep it quiet because they don't want to scare away the tourists. But it's hard to keep something like that quiet," Lily added, lowering her voice even farther as she glanced around the room. "Small town like ours, word gets around."
Reluctantly, Maya accepted the cigarette from Lily again and silently hoped that her friend would continue with her tale. Fortunately, Lily had a knack for gossip.
"Word is they found her dress first, a dainty thing of white lace, torn and drenched in sand," Lily continued. "It was Helen who found it."
Lily was referring to the old woman who wandered the sands early each dawn, collecting whatever debris the sea might have spat out the night before.
"But it wasn't until later that afternoon when they found her," Lily finished off, leaving the sentence hanging ominously in mid-air as if it had hooks on it.
Maya could feel her heart galloping in her chest.
"Just down the coast from where Helen found the dress," Lily whispered, her voice barely aflutter, "washed up like driftwood, face as pale as sea foam, and serene, eerily serene. Her body, though." Lily took one last drag of their shared cigarette before flicking it on the floor and stomping on the remains of it with her shoe. "She was covered in scrapes, bruises marred her smooth skin, and she was naked."
A silence stretched between them, too immense and terrible to break. The implications hung heavily in the air, while Maya's heart pounded in her chest.
"Can't imagine what horrors she lived before her end," Lily murmured, her gaze lost somewhere past the confines of the walk-in freezer they were in, almost as if she could see the dead body lying in front of her.
The smoke from the extinguished cigarette quivered still in the air between them.
"I overheard one of the police detectives on the phone with the sheriff. It seems that this woman was only the latest one to go missing, the third one this summer alone," Lily added, as she pressed her back against the icy steel door to the walk-in freezer, her gaze glassy and vacant. "But she's the only one that turned up."
Lily's grim words were interrupted by a sharp knock on the steel door from outside.
"Girls, you gotta come out now."
Jeff, one of the cooks, said in a tone laced with mild annoyance. The screech of the heavy seal being broken on the freezer door echoed as Lily stumbled backwards into Jeff's body.
Seriously, Jeff? Lily yelled at the man with numerous tattoos covering his arms. Can't you give us a moment?
The customers are starting to get impatient.
Jeff countered.
Well, we can't have that. Lily grumbled to Maya before turning back to Jeff with her winning smile. Just have to put my apron back on real quick.
Jeff rolled his eyes, but turned away anyway. Lily reached over and grabbed her apron, the fabric stiff with cold. Tying it deftly around her waist, she then turned and reached for Maya's hands.
Promise me. Lily gave Maya's hands a tight squeeze. Promise me that you'll be careful if you head out at night. She released Maya's hands slowly, but her worried gaze held firm. I worry about you, you know.
Maya nodded, swallowing past the knot that had lodged in her throat. Lily let out a small sigh of relief. She pulled Maya into a brief hug before stepping away and smoothing down her apron.
Good, she said with a small smile. Now let's get back out there and face the vultures.
Chapter 2. Detective Ames let out a groan of relief as he pulled himself onto the bar stool at his regular go-to diner. After a long night and an early call to work, he was grateful for the chance to sit down and enjoy a meal. As he loosened his tie, all the aches and pains of the day seemed to seep away from him. The diner had an old-fashioned decor, with its worn-out leather seats and rustic wooden tables. The low, humming sound of the ceiling fan echoed through the room, adding a comforting rhythm to Ames's afternoon. He had hardly settled down when he spotted Lily bustling about, her curly blonde hair tied up in a loose bun, strands framing her soft face. He watched as she moved around the diner, dashing between tables with practiced ease. Ames was not normally one for flirting, especially not on duty. But there was something about Lily that defied his professional stoicism. Perhaps it was her lively energy, or maybe it was the way her laughter sprinkled warmth throughout the cold room. Lily approached him, her smile bright despite the weariness lining her eyes. He looked at her and couldn't help but give back a boyish grin. "Tough day?" he asked, keeping his tone light.
She chuckled dryly, leaning on the counter across from him. Something like that, she replied in a tired voice.
"Let me guess," Ames started, leaning forward as if about to reveal a great secret. "The tourists?"
Lily nodded before saying, and let me guess, you'll have your usual?
Ames nodded, just like Lily had, and said, "You know me so well."
Lily laughed, rolling her eyes at his predictability before scribbling down his order onto her notepad. Yes, detective, she said with mock seriousness as she continued to jot it down. Chicken pot pie and a large black coffee.
She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, a silent question hanging in the air between them. Ames inclined his head slightly in response. He appreciated her concern, but also wanted to reassure her.
All right then, she said, tearing off the order slip and moving to pass it through to the kitchen.
Just as she was about to disappear into the back room, a shrill ring echoed through the restaurant, causing a couple of patrons to glance towards the source. The noise emanated from Ames's pocket. He pulled out his cell phone and glanced at the caller ID, the precinct. "Ames here," he answered, still keeping his voice steady, despite the disappointment he had for his meal that was about to be interrupted.
"We just got word on that dead woman that washed up on the beach," came the concise reply from Ames's lieutenant on the other end. "Looks like she was last seen at McMurphy's club, dancing with several men."
Ames groaned. It looked like he'd be missing another meal, just like he had missed this morning's breakfast and last night's dinner. He waved down Lily as he jotted down notes on the stack of napkins in front of him, with the pen he always kept in his breast pocket. "I'll head over there now," Ames said before he cut off the call. Straightening himself up, he offered Lily a weak smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I need to go." His voice was thick with regret and urgency. He reached for his suit jacket draped over the stool next to him, slinging it over his broad shoulders. "Rain check."
Of course. Lily nodded, her smile fading to match his sober expression. Stay safe out there. she called out to him.
Ames turned but staggered back a step as he accidentally ran into the woman that the locals called the mute. "Hello, Maya," Ames said, and then stepped around her as she nodded a greeting. "See you ladies later," Ames called out as he left the diner, the bell ringing as the front door was opened once again. Ames felt the cool ocean breeze hit his face as he exited the building, leaving behind the warm glow of its neon lights. The paved street beneath his soles was deserted, save for the occasional rustling of crumpled newspapers dancing to the tune of a somber breeze. His car, a black 1960s Ford Mustang, stood parked under the shadow of a solitary lamppost across the road, a nostalgic silhouette against a backdrop that yearned for better days. He reached his car, its polished surface gleaming under the sun's light. He ran his fingers over its cold metal surface as he moved to the driver's side door. Unlocking it with a swift turn of his key, he settled into its worn leather seat that cradled him like an old friend, a silent confidant privy to his darkest secrets and deepest sorrows. With a roar, he brought the engine alive, a purring beast under the hood, ready to gallop at his command. He released the handbrake, shifted into gear, and with one last look at the cozy diner fading in his rearview mirror, he hit the gas. The Mustang roared onto the asphalt, leaving behind a whispering echo as it swallowed up the distance between him and McMurphy's club. Taking a right off the main strip, Ames arrived at a smaller road lined with palm trees that waved lazily in the warm afternoon breeze. The bright sun cast long, dancing shadows on the asphalt as he powered down his convertible and coasted along the beachfront. McMurphy's club was perched on the edge of the beach like a grand dame past her prime. During the day, she stood in silence. At night, she transformed into a siren, luring the unsuspecting with pulsating music and flashing lights. Her facade gleamed white under the harsh sunlight, adorned with chipped palmetto leaves painted a faded green. A regal sign, McMurphy's, in elegant cursive, swung lightly from rusted chains above the entrance. As Ames parked his Mustang, humble whispers of laughter and music from nights past seemed to echo from its shabby, chic exterior. He walked in through large double doors painted haphazardly in blue. The interior was dimly lit, quiet, an oasis of calm waiting to erupt into chaos once the sun kissed the horizon goodbye. A handful of staff were bustling around, preparing for another night of revelry and forgotten promises. At the far end of the room stood an imposing bar, rows upon rows of translucent bottles, gleaming like colorful jewels under soft light. Behind it was McMurphy himself, cleaning glasses with quiet intensity, a paradox in his own lively establishment. Ames moved towards him, each step echoing his resolve on the club's wooden floor. "McMurphy," he called out. The burly man looked up, pulsating veins mapping out years of stress and hard work on his face. He recognized Ames instantly, nodding in acknowledgement. "I'm here about the other night," Ames began, his voice steady but laced with concern. He slid onto one of the high stools and passed McMurphy a photo before continuing. "I'm looking for some answers about the lady in this photo who was found murdered this past weekend. She was seen here dancing with a couple of men." McMurphy paused, his gaze drifting past Ames to the deserted dance floor. The sun filtering through the weathered windows cast an eerie glow on the dance floor. Innocent during the day, yet a playground for sin when darkness fell. McMurphy returned his focus to Ames. His eyes had sunken, haunted.
"Yes," he agreed, his accented voice gravelly, like the echo of stones against a deep well. "She was here all right, dancing and laughing, like the fae she was luring men in with her charm." He picked up a glass, scrutinized it for any speck of grime under the dim light of the bar, then continued to polish it with meticulous care. "Lots of strangers come through here, tourists," he continued on the thread of conversation left by Ames. "They see the lights, hear the music, smell the booze, feel the rhythm of the night, and they wander in, seeking solace from their mundane lives or just for a pint or two. All sorts," he added after a pause. His firm hand pressed hard against the glass, his knuckles turning white from the strain. Old ones wanting to relive their youth. Young ones eager to play grown-up for an evening. Rich ones putting on airs, poor ones stealing moments of joy.
"And the woman?" Ames asked, motioning vaguely with his hand as if to draw out her image from McMurphy's words.
McMurphy sighed deeply and turned his gaze back towards the dance floor, where spectral shadows danced in rhythm with invisible music. He seemed lost in thought for a moment before he spoke again. She was one of them too, beautiful like a summer's daydream, and just as fleeting. He looked down at his hands that were still gripping the glass a bit too tightly. As if realizing it for the first time, he released his grip abruptly, as one might release a snake that had somehow slithered into their grip. Yes, he murmured, recalling more. She danced like nobody's business. His eyes took on a distant look, as though he could still see her twirling about under the disco lights. She enchanted them all. The men. They were drawn to her, buying her drinks, lavishing her with attention. But none of them seemed to hold her interest for long, he continued, his voice growing softer. She'd give them a dance, perhaps a laugh or two, then slip away to the next eager suitor. But she wasn't cruel, oh no. She was just seeking something.
Perhaps love, Ames suggested, though he didn't sound particularly convinced of his own words. McMurphy shrugged non-committally.
Could be, he said finally, pressing the glass back onto the counter as if sealing away the thoughts it held. Or maybe just company. Or perhaps she was simply caught in a whirlwind of fragile happiness she wasn't ready to let go of.
And did she leave with anyone? Ames asked suddenly, leaning forward with renewed interest.
McMurphy frowned at the sudden question, squinting as though he were peering into the murky depths of his memory. There's too many people to keep track of, night after night. He gave a helpless shrug, looking apologetic yet somehow resigned. When or with who she left? I couldn't tell you.
Ames sighed, his disappointment echoing silently in the quiet, almost anticipatory atmosphere of the club preparing for the evening's round of revelries. He drummed his fingers on the counter, his mind whirling with frustration and unanswered questions. Any regulars she danced with? He probed further, unwilling to relinquish this lead so easily.
McMurphy gave a huff of laughter. Ain't no such thing as a regular along the beach during the summer months. Tourists come and go, one face melting into the next just as quick.
Right. Ames sighed. Well, if you do see any familiar faces, you know who to call. Ames hated when promising leads lead to dead ends. This whole summer, his lieutenant had been pushing the whole police force, trying to find out what happened to the missing women. This latest one, however, had surprised everyone by turning up. Ames was determined to find the killer before another woman went missing. The detective pushed himself away from the counter, feeling the day's fatigue seeping into his bones. Just as he was about to say goodbye, a thought occurred to him. He turned to McMurphy once again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what about you, McMurphy? Did she ever dance with you?" Ames asked, his tone casual but his gaze intense.
McMurphy paused in his chore of polishing another glass, caught off guard by the question. Me? He echoed, laughter edging his voice. Nah, I'm too old and far too worn out for dancing. I'm content just watching the show from here.
There was a brief silence then, filled only by the distant sound of the sea outside and the slow ticking of a clock on the wall behind them. Ames studied McMurphy for several more seconds before nodding slowly, satisfied with the answer, or perhaps just resigned to the lack of new leads. "All right, then," he muttered, pushing himself up from where he sat and extending a hand towards McMurphy. "I appreciate your time. And remember, if you think of anything else—"
I'll give you a call, McMurphy finished for him, shaking Ames's hand with a firm grip before returning to his glasses. Chapter 3. Colin McMurphy, a world-renowned British fiddle player and lyricist, had spent 25 grueling years touring with a prestigious river dancing troupe. His long-term partner, Sean, his husband in all but name, had enchanted audiences with the Willian pipes. Their love story was one for the ages, at least until a tragic car accident claimed Sean's life just over a decade ago. Devastated and unable to continue performing without his beloved, Colin made the heart-wrenching decision to leave the troupe. He pooled together his life savings, the inheritance Sean had left him, and an unexpected windfall from his great-aunt's passing, to purchase a dilapidated club in a once-thriving tourist town. For 4 months out of each year, the club buzzed with activity, and Colin barely had a moment to catch his breath, let alone dwell on his profound loss. But during the remaining 8 months, when the tourists had long since departed, Colm found himself alone at the counter of his bar, seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle until sleep mercifully overtook him. He now stood behind his bar, pouring cocktail after cocktail, listening to the type of booming music that would have given his poor Sean a migraine. Colm traced the rim of a crystal glass, his heart pounding with the heavy beat that echoed around the room. The atmosphere was thick with eager anticipation as the tourists, a blend of nationalities and ages, clung onto each other, their bodies in a rhythmic trance, accompanied by that chaotic music Sean had always despised. The club was alive in an explosion of colors, from the neon lights flickering overhead to the vibrant outfits of the patrons. A group of Spanish tourists dressed in flamboyant ruffles had formed a dancing circle near the stage, their swift movements sweeping up an infectious energy that permeated throughout the room. Others followed suit, breaking away from their companions to join the celebratory swarm. The air was electric, filled with laughter and foreign tongues interlacing into an exotic symphony of human connection. His bouncers, burly men in stark black uniforms, did their rounds meticulously, scrutinizing every presented ID with keen eyes and firm determination. They were his gatekeepers, protectors of his sanctuary. Their stern faces rarely broke into smiles, but Colm knew they lived for these nights just as much as he did. The waitresses darted through the pulsating crowd like wraiths in their tight black dresses and crisp white aprons. Balanced on trays above their heads were glasses that sparkled like stars against the dimmed ambient light, filled to the brim with colorful concoctions that promised blissful oblivion. The clink of glass against glass created a soothing harmony beneath the booming music, an orchestral performance that only Colm seemed to appreciate. As he watched this wild spectacle unfold before his eyes, Colm poured another cocktail, a vibrant riot of amber and crimson swirling merrily around ice cubes, into an elegantly curved cocktail glass. He remembered how Sean loved quietness enveloping them after a performance. But here, in this cacophonic symphony, Colm had found his solace. Colm felt the sticky residue of high-quality liquor underneath his fingertips, a sensation that momentarily brought him back to the conversation he had with Ames earlier in the day. The detective's stern face flickered in Colm's mind, a shadow among the confetti and lasers. Ames had asked about her, about the missing woman with raven hair and emerald green eyes. Colm had seen plenty of such faces, an unending parade of them through his bar, each face blending into the next like watercolors merging on canvas. Yet he remembered her. Her laughter was contagious. It had cut through the bass-heavy music like a clear bell on a foggy morning. Her absence hung in the air like an unresolved melody. As he shook another cocktail, a mix of sapphire gin and tangy citrus bitters, his thoughts drifted to last year's disappearances. Just as vibrant and colourful men, each with their unique stories, vanishing as though swallowed by the night itself. Then, too, Detective Ames had lumbered into Colm's sanctuary with questions that seemed never-ending. His establishment became a place not only of indulgent celebrations, but a black hole where souls could get lost. Colm shook off these unsettling thoughts. They were bad for business. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, causing him to look up. His gaze landed on the entrance. And there she was, Maya. She was dressed in a burst of colors tonight, her outfit clashing beautifully against her pale skin, as though she herself was a walking piece of art. Her long mahogany hair lay down her back like a silk curtain, as soft and fluid as the movements she made when she danced. The sea of people parted for her as she straightened and began walking across the room, her head high, eyes sparkling with an unspoken energy that attracted men like moths to a flame. Colm watched as a few patrons tried to approach her. Some, bolstered by their liquid courage, tried to win her over with cheesy pickup lines, while others merely stood by watching her with undisguised awe. She moved gracefully, ignorant of their admiration, or perhaps simply choosing not to acknowledge it. She stopped at the bar and slid onto one of the stools, offering Colm a silent wave of recognition. He nodded back, his heart inexplicably quickening at even this brief contact. As he prepared her usual iced tea with a twist of lemon and mint leaves, he couldn't help but ponder on the enigma that was Maya. How many times had he seen her lose herself in the rhythm of music, swaying all night on the dance floor with random partners who could never keep up with her? Yet despite her aura of being an open book, she remained an unsolved mystery to him. With each passing summer, whispers grew louder about why she remained mute. Some gossiped about a tragic love story that left her speechless, while others speculated about a vow of silence taken for reasons only known to Maya herself. Colm wasn't interested in these theories. He was more intrigued about why she seemed so comfortable in this world where sound ruled everything. As he slid her iced tea across the bar, their fingers brushed for a fleeting moment. Her eyes met his and held for a fraction of a second longer than usual, a silent communication of gratitude. She picked up her drink and, with a final nod, merged again into the crowd. Colm watched her go, his heart echoing the rhythm of the music that pounded from the speakers. The bar pulsed with life once more. Tourists and locals mingled, a montage of sunburnt skin and brightly coloured clothes. He could sense the excitement in the air, a sort of intoxicating madness that made people laugh a little louder, dance a little wilder. He began to mix another drink, a frothy concoction of rum, coconut milk, and pineapple, his hands moving with the precision born of long practice. As he worked, his gaze wandered back to Maya. She was dancing now, moving with an innate grace that was as captivating as it was enigmatic. Her partner, for the moment, was a tall man with a shock of blonde hair, a tourist by the looks of him. But there was something else about him, too. Colm squinted at the man, a flicker of recognition igniting in his mind. He had seen him before. His eyes widened as he remembered where, last week, the same man had been dancing with a beautiful redhead. An image flashed across Colm's memory. Her lifeless body sprawled on the sand, her once vibrant green eyes now dull and vacant, the photo that Detective Ames had shown him only hours ago. A loud cheer from the crowd brought Colm back to reality. He studied Maya's dance partner discreetly, noting his wide grin that seemed more predatory than friendly under closer scrutiny. A chill ran down Colm's spine as he wondered if this encounter would have the same deadly finale as the previous one. Maya seemed oblivious to his thoughts, her body swaying rhythmically to the music. There was an ethereal quality about her when she danced like this, lost in a world where silence was her sanctuary. He could only watch, his concern shadowed by his fascination for Maya's unwavering resilience. The air grew thick with anticipation as the music slowed, the night deepening around them. Colm poured another drink, his eyes never leaving Maya and the blonde tourist. As the haunting melody filled the room, Colm watched Maya and the man draw closer. The flickering neon lights of the club painted a surreal landscape on their entwined bodies. A twisted duet of predator and prey, danced out in lurid technicolor. His gaze held an intensity that threatened to burn holes in the scene unfolding before him. With a final flourish, the song ended. The man leaned in closer to Maya, whispering something that brought a coy smile to her face. Colm's heart pounded in a hollow echo against his ribs. The tick-tock rhythm of an unseen clock filled his ears as he watched them make their way toward the exit. Barely able to contain his apprehension, he sprung forward just as the pair disappeared through the club's doors. With brisk strides, he maneuvered through the crowd towards the back room, his senses heightened and alert. Muted laughter and stray chords from a forgotten song silk-wrapped around every corner of the dingy corridor as he stepped into it. The door at the end beckoned him with a tale yet untold. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was small and bare apart from an aging mahogany desk and a single rotary phone resting on its surface. Flicking on a solitary lamp, casting long shadows across the room, Colm yanked out a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket and dialed Detective Ames's number.
Chapter 4. Thomas drew the woman in close as they left the club. He had been surprised to see the silent waitress from the diner dancing in the club, but he was glad that her blonde friend was nowhere in sight. The last thing he wanted was for his night to be interrupted. The woman giggled, her voice lost in the cacophony of city life that swirled around them. She clung onto his arm, unsteady on cobblestone streets that bore silent witness to lives lived and lost. Thomas was distracted by the sharp scent of cheap perfume emanating from her. It reminded him of his earlier victims, all young women lured by his charm and ultimately silenced by his hands. They turned a corner into an alleyway suffused with the stench of rotting garbage and the rank odor of human destitution. He was relieved. It was a familiar scent, one tied to the memories of his other gruesome achievements. The woman shivered and pulled herself tightly against him, her fingers tracing patterns on his forearm through the fabric of his shirt. His heart pounded in his chest, a dark symphony that echoed the anticipation surging within him. He led her further down the alleyway towards his boat, nestled discreetly amongst other shabby vessels at the desolate marina. Unlike its neighbors, which were weather-beaten and neglected, Thomas's boat was immaculate, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He cast a sidelong glance at her as he untied the boat from its moorings. Her face, haloed by streetlight, barely concealed a gaunt angularity beneath heavily applied makeup. Her lips were painted a bright cherry red, much like those of his previous victims. Thomas smiled at her as he helped her aboard. He watched her silhouette disappear into the cabin before he followed suit. After all, Thomas enjoyed a good game of cat and mouse. As he stepped into the cabin, he shut the door behind him, the soft click of the lock sending a shudder of excitement down his spine. The interior was modest, but well-maintained, every surface gleaming under the soft glow of carefully placed electric candles. He enjoyed this contrast, the civilized shelter juxtaposed with his savage intentions. The woman was sitting on a plush lounge by the window, her spindly legs crossed under her. She was looking out at the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Little did she know that they were no more reachable for her than those celestial bodies. Thomas moved closer, his shoes silent on the carpeted floor. He observed her with avid interest, the way her chest rose and fell in rhythmic anticipation, how her fingers fiddled with her dress nervously. He reveled in it, this raw, tangible fear that only added to his thrill. He was a predator within his craft, much like a maestro leading an orchestra into a crescendo of terror. There was a skill to it, precision laced with careful patience. Every woman was a melody that he built up note by note until reaching that climactic end, his sinister symphony. The sight of the woman, her silhouette bathed in the soft glow of the lights, was like a beautiful painting. She was an unknowing muse, the innocent subject in his macabre masterpiece. He savored this moment, letting the anticipation build up inside him, filling up every crevice of his being. Thomas stalked forward, a panther in its prime. His footsteps created gentle whispers on the lush carpets, a lullaby before the storm. The scent of her was intoxicating, a blend of cheap perfume and fear. It danced around him like a seductive wisp into his senses, causing his heart to smolder with an insatiable hunger. Reaching out to touch her was like igniting a wick to a dormant flame. Her skin was soft and delicate under his calloused fingers. It felt like tracing patterns onto marzipan icing over a cake freshly baked from Hell's Kitchen. The way she recoiled at his touch only added fuel to his fire, heightening his sadistic ecstasy. Thomas moved closer still until he could feel her warm breath on his skin, carrying desperate pleas for mercy wrapped in hushed whispers. He could sense her pulse quicken, echoing his own rhythmic heartbeat. It was a symphony written in scarlet notes, composed under the baton of terror and performed on the grand stage of fear. His hands roamed over her body slowly, each touch calculated like he was playing keys on a ghastly piano, creating an impromptu tune of torment. She struggled beneath his hold, her writhing movements resembling a dying swan's final dance. It was exquisite in its brutality, a ballet of fear pirouetting to the rhythm of his perverse pleasure. Yet he was not a brute, he was an artist, a sculptor carving out a masterpiece from raw fear and abject submission. Each whimper she let out was another stroke on his canvas. Each tear that slid down her face was another nuance to his creation. He was no simple predator. He began to recount the tales of his previous victims, their names whispered like a grotesque lullaby. Virginia, Sarah, Cecilia. Each name was a testament of the masterpieces he had created with his wicked hands. The dance of fear that each had danced before they drew their final breath was a melody he relished in replaying. As he described each gruesome detail, he mirrored his actions on her trembling form. He narrated how Virginia's petite fingers had clawed at his arms, her sobs growing louder with each passing second. He mimicked the same movement on her, pressing his fingertips into the soft flesh of her arms just enough to leave faint imprints. Sarah had been a fighter, he recounted. She had thrashed and fought until her last breath was wrenched from her body by his hands. He forced this unnamed woman into a struggle, pushing and pulling, forcing her to experience the same dance of despair Sarah had endured. With Cecilia, it had been different. She had watched him with wide eyes filled with terror and acceptance, understanding that her fate was sealed. His fingers traced the path of tears down this woman's face as he depicted how Cecilia's eyes had stared right through him as life slipped away from her. Each account unveiled a different dance of death choreographed by him, a macabre tableau enacted with cruel precision. The moonlight seeping into the room bathed his face in an eerie pallor as he continued, "And now, you are next." The woman nodded, her face still shrouded under the veil of intoxication. There was something unsettling about her nonchalance, but he brushed it off as drunken bravado. "I think drowning will be appropriate for you," he said, leaning closer to whisper the morbid details into her ear. His fingers, cold and cruel, trailed down from her chin to her throat, mimicking the chokehold that would soon claim her life. He relished the dread that usually crept into his victims' eyes when they realized their imminent doom. But this time, instead of fear dawning in her eyes, a sinister, knowing smile spread across her lips, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. Her act of being drunk ceased abruptly, replaced by a malevolent, inhuman presence that filled the air with an oppressive, suffocating dread. Her body began to twist and contort in ways that defied the constraints of human anatomy, her bones snapping and reforming as her skin rippled and stretched grotesquely. Before his horrified eyes, she transformed into a nightmarish abomination, her once beautiful features distorted into a visage of pure, unadulterated terror. Long, sinewy tendrils, slick with a viscous black substance, burst forth from where her arms used to be, wrapping tightly around him like a vice. Her grip was unbreakable, and she dragged him towards herself with a strength that was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The room spun violently around him as she hoisted him up effortlessly, and then everything became a dizzying, nightmarish blur. When his senses returned, he found himself suspended over a churning, ink-black sea, the waves crashing against jagged rocks that jutted out like the teeth of some enormous, primordial beast. Panic flooded his system as he realized her intentions, but it was too late. With one swift, brutal movement, she hurled him overboard, casting him into the merciless, icy depths below. As the frigid, unforgiving sea engulfed him, filling his lungs with brackish water, he finally understood that his own twisted dance of death had come to a horrific and ironic end.
The hunter had become the hunted. The predator was now the prey, and his screams were silenced by the uncaring depths. She watched with a malevolent, otherworldly glee as his body was dragged down into the abyss, her luminous, monstrous form a beacon of unholy light against the suffocating darkness. The sea had claimed its latest victim, and she reveled in the knowledge that her kind would never again fall prey to his malevolent desires. As she slipped back into the depths, her form shifting and merging with the endless expanse of the ocean, the moon cast an eerie, blood-red glow upon the surface, a silent, uncaring witness to the macabre scene that had just unfolded. The night concealed her dark secret, and the sea would keep it for eternity, along with the countless other horrors that lurked beneath its inscrutable surface. Chapter 5. The cave loomed before Maya, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow all light and hope. She dragged the man's lifeless body across the sand, leaving a trail of crimson that glistened in the moonlight. His skin, once flush with life, now held the pallor of death, As she entered the cave, the air grew thick and oppressive, filled with the stench of decay and the weight of countless secrets. The skeletons of her previous victims lined the walls, their hollow eye sockets staring accusingly at her, a silent jury to her crimes. She laid the man's body down amidst the sea of bones, the sound of cracking and snapping echoing through the cavern as she arranged his limbs in a grotesque tableau. The cave drew a chilling silence around them as Maya returned to her human form, or as close as she could manage, standing stark against those silent keepers of murderous secrets. Her gaze fixed on his lifeless form, for a moment longer than necessary, not out of remorse, but rather quiet contemplation. "I wasn't going to kill again this summer," she whispered, her voice a rasping, inhuman growl. "Last year, with the string of tourists, the police were almost catching on." She crouched down next to the man's body, running a clawed finger along his cold, lifeless cheek. "But then, you had to come and kill those women, didn't you?" she hissed, her words dripping with venom. "It wasn't hard to figure out it was you. You smelled of rot, of death and decay. As soon as Lily told me what happened, and I overheard Detective Ames on the phone, I knew it was you." Maya's gaze drifted to the skeleton beside her, and she stroked its bleached white skull with a twisted affection. "How fortunate that we would find the same hunting ground," she mused, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "McMurphy's, where all those men gathered, laughing in their drunken glory. The perfect place for us predators. You, targeting innocent women, and I was after a different game." She traced the man's lifeless hand, her touch as cold as the grave. "I remember the first night, the neon lights flashing, music blaring. Those men last summer who were so content to roofie Lily and her other friends. Take them back to their hotel room and defile them. One after one after one." Maya glared at the skeletons. Lily couldn't stop crying for days, but she wouldn't go to the police, and neither would the other women. "But they told me what those men looked like, and I knew I had to find them." Maya's eyes grew distant, lost in the memories of her dark deeds. "I remember how they then approached me at McMurphy's, one by one. The greasy-haired salesman from Minnesota, the young stockbroker with too much money and not enough brains, and the rest. All arrogant and full of themselves. They thought they were the hunters, but I was watching, always watching." She leaned back against the rough cave wall, the shadows from the moon dancing across her form. "They slipped roofies into my drinks, thinking it would make me easy prey. Foolish men," she sneered, a cruel laugh echoing through the cavern. "But I had prepared myself for them." Maya's voice dropped to a sinister whisper. "An antidote mixed into every drink I consumed before their arrival. Their gifts had no effect on me, but as they watched for their prize to succumb to their deceitful tricks, it was they who became vulnerable. One by one, I took them down, a swift cut to their throats in some dark alley, or an intimate poison kiss, just as they thought they'd won." Silence fell over the cave, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the shore. Maya turned her gaze back to this newest man's body, her eyes burning with a hellish light. "But you," she whispered, her voice a chilling caress, You were the worst of them, taking innocent lives for your perverse pleasure. I had a special death planned for you, and here you are." With methodical precision, Maya began to arrange his body among the others, the bones of her victims shifting and clattering as she made room for their new companion. The cave had become a monument to her vengeance, a grotesque tribute to the men who had wronged her. "You won't mind if I borrow this, will you?" she asked his silent form, carefully fishing into his pockets and locating his wallet. The sound of leather creaking under her touch echoed flat against the walls of the cave. She opened it and found a wad of dollars, credit cards embossed with his name, a name she would gladly forget. She shoved the cash into her socks and then slid the cards out and flung them into the ocean. A small ritual for each of her victims, a purge of their identities, a final insult to their memory. "Look at what you've done," she whispered, glancing briefly at the pile of bones behind her before staring back at him. "Made me into a thief as well as a killer." She looked thoughtful for a moment before shrugging nonchalantly. "It doesn't matter now. You're all paid in full." Rising on unsteady legs, Maya cast one last look at her grim arrangement before turning toward the sparkling expanse of water before her. The cave had served its purpose. It was now a graveyard for those who had wronged her. "I'm leaving this God-forsaken place," she announced to her victims, her voice blending with the wind. "Your money is going to fund my new start, on an island far from here, somewhere peaceful." As she worked, Maya's mind drifted to her past, to the man who had started it all. Her father, the one who had stolen her mother's sealskin and bound her to a life of misery and pain. She remembered the night she had finally found the strength to fight back, to drive a bat into his skull and watch the life drain from his eyes. "Father," she murmured, crouching down beside his skeletal remains. "You know, I used to lie awake at night, wishing you dead. I was so afraid of you. Now look at us." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, echoing through the cave like a curse. "I killed you," she said plainly. "After all those years, I killed you. You beat me within an inch of my life, so I ended yours." Maya rose to her feet, brushing the sand from her knees. She cast one last look at the man's body, now just another trophy in her collection, before turning toward the entrance of the cave. "And guess what?" she mused, her voice a haunting whisper. "I will miss you." With those final words, Maya stepped out into the night, the moonlight casting an eerie glow upon her monstrous form. She made her way to the shore, the sea calling to her, beckoning her home. As she waded into the frigid waters, Maya felt the change come over her once more. Her human guise melted away, revealing the sleek, spotted pelt of her true form. She dove beneath the waves, the ocean embracing her like a long-lost lover. And as she swam deeper into the abyss, Maya knew that she would never return to this place of nightmares. The cave would stand as a testament to her pain, to the horrors she had endured, and the vengeance she had wrought. Each moment further into the water was a step closer to freedom, to family, to herself.